The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Richmond's public square like a shroud, unable to hide the shame of what was about to unfold. October 15th, 1847 would be remembered not for the crisp autumn air or the golden leaves that danced in the breeze, but for the moment when human dignity was stripped away and sold to the highest bidder. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Standing at the edge of the gathered crowd, Chief Joseph Thornfield adjusted the collar of his tailored coat, his weathered hands steady despite the rage burning in his chest. At 52, he carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had bridged two worlds, the Cherokee nation of his birth and the white society that had tried to erase his people's existence. His dark eyes, sharp as obsidian, surveyed the scene before him with the calculating precision of someone who had learned to navigate treacherous waters. The auction block stood like an altar of human misery in the center of Richmond's courthouse square. Built from rough-hewn oak that had darkened with age and weather, it rose 3 feet above the crowd, forcing those unfortunate enough to stand upon it to face the sea of faces below. Today, like every third Tuesday of the month, it would serve its most despicable purpose. Rebecca Hartford stood on that platform, her spine straight, despite the weight of humiliation pressing down upon her shoulders. At 24, she possessed the kind of beauty that would have opened doors in different circumstances: auburn hair that caught the morning light, green eyes that spoke of intelligence and determination, and features that belonged in a portrait rather than on an auction block. But today, none of that mattered. Today, she was simply lot number 7. In her arms, she cradled her 6-month-old daughter, little Mary, whose innocent blue eyes gazed up at the world with the trusting wonder that only babies possess. The child had no understanding of the transaction about to take place, no comprehension that her mother's mounting debts to the Hartford family estate, debts inherited through marriage to a man who had died owing more than he'd ever owned, had led them to this moment. Joseph had not come to Richmond seeking to involve himself in human misery. His journey to Virginia's capital had been strictly business. Negotiations with tobacco merchants who dealt with his Cherokee Trading Company, discussions about railroad rights through tribal lands, and meetings with politicians who still viewed him as a curiosity rather than an equal. His success in building bridges between his people and white society had earned him respect, wealth, and influence, but it had also isolated him from both worlds. The Cherokee nation had been scattered to the winds by the Trail of Tears 9 years. Earlier, their ancestral land seized, their people forced to march westward in a death march that claimed thousands of lives. Joseph had been among the few who had seen the writing on the wall early enough to establish himself legally in white society, using his education at Yale and his facility with both languages to build a trading empire that spanned from the eastern seaboard to the frontier territories. But success had come at a price. To many of his own people, he was a sellout who had abandoned his heritage for white man's gold. To white society, he would always be an outsider, tolerated for his usefulness, but never truly accepted. He existed in the space between worlds, belonging fully to neither. The auctioneer, a thin man named Cornelius Blackwood, with a voice that carried the practiced cadence of someone who had spent years selling everything from livestock to human beings, stepped forward with his leather-bound ledger. His reputation in Richmond was well established. He could move merchandise faster than anyone in Virginia, and he asked no questions about the circumstances that brought people to his block. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blackwood called out, his voice cutting through the morning air like a knife, "we come now to lot number 7. One Rebecca Hartford, age 24, recently widowed, along with infant female child, age approximately 6 months. The crowd stirred with interest. Debt auctions had become increasingly common as the economic panic of 1837 continued to ripple through Virginia's economy. Families who had lived comfortably for generations found themselves destitute overnight, their homes and possessions seized to satisfy creditors. When those seizures weren't enough to cover the outstanding obligations, the debtors themselves could be sold into indentured servitude. Mrs. Hartford comes to us from the estate settlement of her late husband, William Hartford, formerly of Henrico County, Blackwood continued, consulting his papers with the detached efficiency of a man reading a livestock manifest. She possesses skills in household management, needlework, and basic education. The child appears healthy and well-formed. Joseph felt his jaw clench at the clinical description. He had witnessed many injustices in his 52 years, had seen his own people treated as obstacles to be removed or resources to be exploited. But there was something particularly grotesque about watching a young mother and child reduced to entries in a ledger book. Rebecca's story had become painfully common in post-panic Virginia. Her husband William had inherited a modest tobacco plantation from his family, along with debts that he had hidden from his new bride until it was too late. When blight destroyed 2 consecutive crops and creditors came calling, William had taken increasingly desperate measures to keep his family afloat. The final blow had come when William attempted to transport a load of tobacco to Richmond personally, hoping to cut out the middleman and squeeze a few extra dollars from his depleted harvest. The wagon had overturned on a rain-slicked road, killing William instantly and destroying the cargo that represented their last hope of solvency. Rebecca had tried to maintain the plantation alone, but a woman without family connections or independent wealth had few options in 1847 Virginia. The creditors had been patient at first, understanding that a widow needed time to settle her affairs, but patience had its limits. And when it became clear that the plantation's assets wouldn't cover William's debts, they had exercised their legal right to claim her personal service as compensation. "The terms of indenture are as follows," Blackwood announced, his voice rising to ensure everyone in the square could hear. 7 years of service to satisfy the outstanding debt of $437.16, plus auction fees and administrative costs. The successful bidder will receive full legal authority over the labor and residence of both mother and child for the duration of the contract. In the crowd, Joseph noticed the types of men who typically attended such auctions. Plantation owners, looking for household staff who couldn't run away, factory foremen seeking workers who couldn't demand wages, and others whose interest in a young woman and infant child suggested purposes too dark to contemplate openly. Near the front, a heavy-set man in an expensive but poorly tailored coat caught Joseph's attention. Silas Crammond owned a textile mill outside Richmond, where working conditions were known to be particularly brutal. His last 3 indentured servants had died within 2 years of beginning their service, victims of what Cramond's purchased physicians had declared to be various unfortunate illnesses. Behind Cramond stood Dr. Ezra Whitmore, whose medical practice catered to Richmond's elite, but whose reputation for taking liberties with vulnerable patients had made him unwelcome in polite society. Whitmore's interest in young women with nowhere to turn had been an open secret for years, protected by his wealth and connections. Joseph's hands clenched into fists as he recognized the predators circling this vulnerable woman and child. He had come to Richmond to conduct business, not to involve himself in the tragic commerce of human misery. But something about Rebecca, Hartford's defiant posture, the way she held her child protectively while facing down a crowd of men who saw her as property, reminded him of another woman from another time. His wife, Morning Star, had possessed that same fierce dignity when Cherokee removal agents had come to take their land. She had stood in the doorway of their cabin, their own infant son in her arms, refusing to submit to injustice even when resistance seemed futile. The memory of her courage, in the face of overwhelming odds, had sustained Joseph through the darkest days that followed. Morning Star and their son had not survived the winter of 1838. Disease and exposure had claimed them both during the forced march westward, leaving Joseph with nothing but survivor's guilt and a burning determination to build something from the ashes of his former life. He had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, amassing wealth and influence that few men of any race could match, but success had never filled the hollow space where his family used to be. "Bidding will commence at $50, Blackwood announced, bringing Joseph's attention back to the present moment. The amount was substantial, more than many working men earned in 3 months, but for 7 years of labor, it represented a considerable bargain for anyone willing to invest in human property. The square fell silent, except for the shuffling of feet and the distant sound of horses moving through Richmond's busy streets. $50 was serious money, and the men in attendance were calculating whether the potential return justified the investment. "Come now, gentlemen," Blackwood pressed, his voice taking on the coaxing tone of a man who understood his audience. "Consider the value proposition. 7 years of dedicated service from a woman of proven domestic capabilities, plus a child, who can be trained from infancy to serve your household's needs. In 7 years, that infant will be old enough to contribute meaningful labor to your operations." Joseph felt sick at the casual discussion of molding a child into a servant from birth. Little Mary gurgled contentedly in her mother's arms, oblivious to the futures being planned for her by strangers. $40, a voice called from the back of the crowd. Joseph turned to see a man in work clothes whom he didn't recognize, probably a farmer looking for help with the upcoming harvest season. $45, countered another bidder, this one closer to the front. The auction was beginning in earnest, now with various men testing the waters to see how high the bidding might go. Rebecca's face remained impassive, but Joseph could see the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her grip on her daughter. She was trying to maintain her dignity in an inherently undignified situation, putting on a brave face for her child, even as strangers negotiated for ownership of their lives. $60, Crammond called out, his voice confident and businesslike. The textile mill owner had clearly decided that 7 years of guaranteed labor at no ongoing wages represented a sound investment, regardless of what those 7 years might cost in human terms. The bid sent a murmur through the crowd. $60 was moving beyond casual interest into serious money territory. Several of the smaller bidders stepped back, their calculations apparently determining that the price was rising beyond their means. Joseph found himself studying Rebecca's face more carefully, trying to read the thoughts behind her careful composure. Did she know the reputations of the men bidding on her? Did she understand that some fates were worse than others? Or was she simply hoping that whoever won would treat her and her daughter with basic human decency? $75, Doctor, Whitmore called out, his cultured voice carrying easily across the square. The physician's bid drew knowing looks from several men in the crowd, none of them approving, but all of them understanding exactly what kind of service Whitmore expected from young women in his employ. Rebecca's composure cracked slightly at Whitmore's bid. She had clearly heard the stories, understood what working in the doctor's household would mean for her and potentially for her daughter as the years passed. For the first time since taking the platform, she looked genuinely frightened. Joseph felt the familiar rage building in his chest, the same fury that had sustained him through years of fighting for his people's rights, through the humiliation of being treated as less than human by men who considered themselves civilized. He had learned to channel that anger into productive action, to use his position and resources to effect change rather than simply lash out at injustice. But watching a young mother and infant child being auctioned off like livestock to men who would exploit them in the worst possible ways tested the limits of his carefully maintained self-control. $80, Crammond responded quickly, clearly unwilling to let Whitmore claim the prize without a fight. The textile mill owner's face had flushed red with the excitement of competition, and Joseph could see the calculating gleam in his eyes as he assessed his opponent's resolve. The bidding was moving beyond casual interest now, entering territory where serious money was being discussed. Joseph watched the faces in the crowd, noting which men were still actively participating and which had been priced out of the competition. Most disturbing was the realization that both Crammond and Whitmore had deeper pockets than their current bids suggested. This auction could continue for some time, with Rebecca and her daughter forced to stand on the platform while their futures were decided by men whose intentions grew more sinister with each passing bid. Joseph had spent 9 years building bridges between worlds, learning to work within systems of power rather than raging uselessly against them. He had accumulated wealth and influence precisely so that he could make a difference when moments like this arose. Standing at the edge of Richmond's courthouse square, watching a young mother and her innocent child being sold to the highest bidder, Joseph Thornfield realized that all his carefully planned business meetings, all his diplomatic negotiations and political maneuvering had led to this single moment of moral clarity. Some injustices demanded more than diplomatic solutions. Some situations required a man to step forward and act, regardless of the consequences for his carefully constructed life. As Crammond opened his mouth to raise his bid again, Joseph made his decision. The time for passive observation had ended. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. $90, Crammond's voice boomed across the square, his confidence growing with each successful bid. The textile mill owner had clearly decided that whatever it cost to secure Rebecca Hartford's indenture contract would be worthwhile, given his notorious reputation for working his servants until they collapsed. Joseph watched the color drain from Rebecca's face as she recognized the implications of Crammond's determination. Everyone in Richmond knew about the conditions at Crammond's mill, the 14-hour workdays, the unheated dormitories where workers slept 3 to a bed, the accidents that claimed fingers and sometimes entire hands from exhausted employees, who could no longer maintain focus around the dangerous machinery. Dr. Whitmore straightened his expensive waistcoat, clearly preparing to counter Crammond's bid. The physician's wealth far exceeded that of the mill owner, inherited from a family that had built their fortune on the backs of enslaved labor across 3 generations. If Whitmore decided he truly wanted Rebecca Hartford, few men in Virginia could outbid him. $100. Whitmore called out smoothly, his cultured accent carrying the casual confidence of a man who had never worried about money. The bid sent a ripple of excitement through the crowd. $100 was more than many families saw in an entire year. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, her arms tightening protectively around little Mary. The infant had begun to fuss, sensing her mother's distress even if she couldn't understand its source. The sound of the baby's whimpering seemed to energize the crowd, reminding them that they were bidding on 2 lives rather than 1. $110. Crammond responded immediately, his jaw set with stubborn determination. The mill owner had invested too much pride in this competition to back down now, even as the bidding moved beyond reasonable financial calculations. Joseph felt the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He had built his post-Trail of Tears life on careful calculation, measured risks, and diplomatic solutions to complex problems. Intervening in this auction would draw attention he didn't want and create complications he couldn't predict. But memories of Morningstar's courage in the face of impossible odds strengthened his resolve. His wife had taught him that some principles were worth any sacrifice, that there were moments when a person had to choose between safety and righteousness. $200, Joseph called out, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur. Like a blade through silk, the square fell silent. $200 was an extraordinary sum, enough to buy a small farm, purchase a team of horses, or live comfortably for 2 years. For an indenture contract, it was absolutely unprecedented. Every head in the crowd turned to locate the source of this impossible bid. Joseph stepped forward, his tall frame moving through the gathered men with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to command. His dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples, caught the morning light, and his clothes, well-tailored but understated, spoke of wealth without ostentation. Auctioneer Blackwood blinked several times, clearly struggling to process what he had just heard. In 20 years of conducting debt auctions, he had never encountered a bid that dramatically exceeded the established market rate for human labor. "Did you say $200, sir?" Blackwood managed, his voice slightly strained. $200. Joseph confirmed, his tone calm and measured. For both the woman and child, with immediate payment in gold coin. Crammond spun around to face this unexpected competitor, his face flushed red with anger and disbelief. The mill owner had never seen Joseph before, but the stranger's expensive clothes and confident bearing suggested wealth that could support such extravagant bidding. "This is irregular," Crammond sputtered, looking around the crowd for support. "Who is this man? What are his intentions?" Joseph met Crammond's gaze steadily, his dark eyes revealing nothing of the storm of emotions beneath his calm exterior. "My name is Joseph Thornfield, and my intentions are my own business." The name Thornfield carried weight in Richmond's business community. Joseph's trading company had contracts with tobacco merchants, shipping firms, and railroad developers throughout Virginia. His success in navigating both Cherokee politics and white business culture had made him a valuable intermediary for complex commercial negotiations. Dr. Whitmore stepped forward, his pale blue eyes studying Joseph with the calculating intensity of a man accustomed to reading people's weaknesses. "Mr. Thornfield, surely you understand that such an excessive bid raises questions about motivation. What could you possibly want with a domestic servant that would justify such an investment?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a pistol shot. Joseph understood the implication. In the minds of these men, no one spent $200 on a woman and child without expecting certain services that had nothing to do with household management. "What I want," Joseph said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low tone, "is to ensure that a mother and her child are treated with basic human dignity, something that seems to be in short supply at this gathering." The insult was subtle, but unmistakable. Joseph had essentially accused every man present of being willing to purchase human beings for exploitation, which was exactly what they were doing. The crowd stirred uneasily, some men looking uncomfortable at having their intentions described so bluntly. Crammond's face grew even redder. "Now, see here, Thornfield, there's nothing undignified about honest labor. I provide employment for dozens of people at my mill." "Employment," Joseph repeated, his tone suggesting he found the word amusing. "Is that what you call 14-hour days for workers who can't quit, can't negotiate their wages, and can't leave when conditions become unbearable?" The mill owner's jaw worked furiously, but he couldn't deny the accuracy of Joseph's description. Indentured servitude was slavery in all but name, a legal fiction that allowed men like Crammond to work people to death without the financial investment required to purchase actual slaves. Dr. Whitmore attempted to diffuse the tension with his practiced bedside manner. "Gentlemen, surely we can conduct this business without personal animosity. Mr. Thornfield, your concerns about worker welfare are admirable but perhaps misplaced. Mrs. Hartford requires employment, and we are providing it." "At what cost to her?" Joseph asked, his gaze shifting to Rebecca. The young woman had been following the conversation with growing awareness that her fate was being decided by forces beyond her control. Her green eyes met his for a moment, and he saw both fear and desperate hope in their depths. "The cost is 7 years of honest work in exchange for debt forgiveness," Whitmore replied smoothly. "A fair exchange that benefits everyone involved." Joseph almost laughed at the physician's description of fairness. 7 years of a woman's life, possibly including the use of her body for purposes she couldn't refuse, in exchange for a debt she had never personally incurred, the mathematics of exploitation disguised as benevolence. $250, Joseph said, cutting off further discussion. The crowd gasped audibly. $250 was ranch money, plantation money, the kind of sum that could change a person's entire life circumstances. For an indenture contract, it was beyond comprehension. Blackwood's hands trembled slightly as he consulted. His ledger, clearly out of his depth. Debt auctions were supposed to be routine affairs where desperate people went to the lowest responsible bidder. Joseph Thornfield was transforming it into something unprecedented and potentially dangerous. "Mr. Thornfield," Blackwood said carefully, "I must ask if you have the means to support such a bid. The law requires immediate payment in full." Joseph reached into his coat and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the heavy sound of gold. Coins. He opened it deliberately, allowing the morning sunlight to catch the gleam of genuine currency. The sight of actual gold silenced any doubts about his financial capability. "Would you like me to count it out now?" Joseph asked, his tone suggesting he was perfectly willing to conduct the entire transaction on the courthouse steps. Crammond and Whitmore exchanged uncertain glances. Both men had deeper financial resources than their current bids suggested, but $250 was moving beyond rational calculation into territory where pride and stubbornness would be the only motivations for continued bidding. More importantly, Joseph's public challenge to their intentions had created a social dynamic that neither man could comfortably navigate. Continuing to bid would essentially confirm that they valued Rebecca Hartford enough to spend outrageous sums, which would raise uncomfortable questions about their motivations. $300, Whitmore said finally, his voice tight with suppressed anger. The bid drew murmurs of amazement from the crowd. $300 was serious wealth, enough to buy property or establish a business. The physician's willingness to spend such a sum on a woman and child was creating exactly the kind of speculation about his intentions that he had hoped to avoid. Joseph studied Whitmore's face, reading the calculation behind the man's pale eyes. The physician was committed now, his reputation tied to the outcome of this increasingly public display. Backing down would suggest either financial weakness or acknowledgement that his intentions were indeed questionable. But Joseph had advantages that Whitmore couldn't match. His wealth came from legitimate business success rather than inherited exploitation. His motivations were genuinely altruistic rather than predatory. And most importantly, he had already lost everything that truly mattered to him. He had nothing left to lose except money. $500, Joseph said quietly. The silence that followed was profound and complete. $500 was beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest Virginia families. It was investment capital, the foundation for business empires, enough money to live comfortably for a decade without working. Rebecca Hartford stared at Joseph in complete bewilderment. She had resigned herself to being purchased by men whose intentions terrified her, had prepared to endure whatever horrors awaited in exchange for her daughter's survival. The idea that someone would pay such an extraordinary sum simply to rescue her was beyond her comprehension. Whitmore's face had gone pale beneath his carefully groomed whiskers. The physician possessed the wealth to match Joseph's bid, but doing so would require explaining to his social circle why he had spent $500 on an indentured servant. Such scrutiny would inevitably lead to uncomfortable questions about his past treatment of vulnerable women. Crammond stepped back entirely, his face revealing the bitter recognition that he had been outmatched by forces beyond his understanding. The mill owner's pride had carried him further than his finances could comfortably support, and $500 was simply impossible. "Going once," Blackwood called, his voice cracking with nervous energy. The auctioneer had never conducted a sale of this magnitude and wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. Joseph stood motionless, his leather pouch of gold coins visible in his hand, waiting to see if anyone would dare match his unprecedented bid. Around him, the crowd buzzed with excitement and speculation, everyone trying to understand what they had just witnessed. "Going twice," Blackwood continued, looking desperately around the square for any sign of continued interest. Whitmore opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. $500 would draw too much attention, create too many questions he couldn't answer satisfactorily. With visible reluctance, he stepped back from the platform. "Sold!" Blackwood shouted, his voice carrying relief along with amazement. "To Mr. Joseph Thornfield for $500. The crowd erupted in excited conversation, everyone talking at once about what they had just witnessed. Joseph ignored the commotion entirely, his attention focused on the young woman who was now, by law, his responsibility. Rebecca Hartford remained motionless on the platform, clutching her daughter and staring at the man who had just paid a fortune, for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. Her green eyes searched his face for clues about his intentions, trying to read the character of someone who had just altered the course of her life with a simple bid. Joseph approached the platform, slowly, very aware that every person in the square was watching his next move. How he conducted himself in the next few minutes would determine not only Rebecca's initial impression of him, but also the stories that would spread throughout Richmond about this unprecedented auction. "Mrs. Hartford," he said quietly, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect that surprised everyone present. "My name is Joseph Thornfield. I believe we should discuss your future." Rebecca's legs trembled as she stepped down from the auction platform, her daughter Mary clutched protectively against her chest. The weight of the morning's events pressed down upon her like a physical force, the humiliation of being displayed. Like merchandise, the terror of hearing Crammond and Whitmore bid for her life, and now the bewildering reality of being purchased by a man whose motivations remained completely mysterious. Joseph extended his hand to help her navigate the platform's steep steps, a gesture of courtesy that seemed absurdly formal given that he had just bought legal ownership of her existence. His touch was brief and respectful, his dark eyes meeting hers with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, determination mixed with something that might have been regret. "We should move away from the crowd," Joseph said quietly, glancing around the courthouse square, where knots of men continued their animated discussions about the unprecedented auction. "Too many ears interested in our business," Rebecca nodded mutely, following him toward a quieter section of the square near the old elm tree that had witnessed countless public gatherings over the decades. Her mind reeled with questions she didn't dare voice. What did this man expect from her? Why had he paid such an extraordinary sum? And most importantly, what would happen to Mary? As they walked, Rebecca became acutely aware of the stairs following their movement. Every person in the square was trying to puzzle out the relationship between the well-dressed Cherokee businessman and the debt-ridden widow he had just purchased. The speculation would fuel Richmond's gossip mills for months to come. Joseph seemed oblivious to the attention, his focus entirely on navigating them to relative privacy. When they reached the shade of the elm tree, he turned to face Rebecca directly, his expression serious but not unkind. "Mrs. Hartford," he began, his voice low enough that their conversation couldn't be overheard. "I need you to understand something. Important. What just happened back there, the legal transaction, that's not how I intend for us to proceed." Rebecca's grip on Mary tightened instinctively. In her experience, when men spoke about intentions, it rarely boded well for women in vulnerable positions. "I'm not sure I understand, Mr. Thornfield. The indenture contract gives me legal authority over your labor and residence for 7 years, Joseph continued, choosing his words carefully. But I have no intention of treating you as property. What I'm offering you is employment, not ownership." The distinction seemed too good to be true. Rebecca had learned through bitter experience that men who made generous promises often expected even more generous compensation in return. Employment doing what exactly? Joseph paused, clearly having anticipated this question but still struggling with how to answer it honestly. "I own a trading company that does business throughout Virginia and into the frontier territories. My household staff consists of exactly one person, myself. I need someone who can manage correspondence, keep accounts, and handle the domestic arrangements that allow me to focus on business." It sounded almost reasonable, which immediately made Rebecca suspicious. "And Mary? What about my daughter?" "Your daughter stays with you, of course." Joseph's response was immediate and firm. "A child belongs with her mother. Anyone who thinks differently is not someone worth knowing." Mary chose that moment to wake fully, her blue eyes opening to take in this new environment with the serious curiosity that characterized her young life. She studied Joseph's face with the intent focus that babies reserved for trying to understand unfamiliar adults. "She's beautiful," Joseph said softly, and Rebecca was surprised to hear genuine warmth in his voice. "How old is she?" 6 months, Rebecca replied, unconsciously relaxing slightly at his tone. "Her name is Mary Elizabeth, after my mother." "Mary Elizabeth," Joseph repeated, offering the baby a gentle smile. "That's a strong name for a strong girl." The baby responded by reaching one tiny hand toward Joseph's face, her fingers grasping at the air between them. Without thinking, Joseph extended his own hand, allowing Mary to wrap her miniature fingers around his thumb with the determined grip that babies used to explore their world. Rebecca watched this interaction with careful attention, looking for any sign of impatience or discomfort from the man who had just acquired legal responsibility for both their lives. Instead, she saw something unexpected, genuine tenderness from someone who clearly had experience with children. "You've held babies before," she observed, more a statement than a question. Joseph's expression grew distant for a moment, his dark eyes focusing on something far beyond the courthouse square. "I had a son once. He would have been about 10 years old now if he had lived." The simple statement carried depths of grief that Rebecca recognized immediately. She had seen that same hollow pain in her own mirror during the darkest days after William's death, when the future stretched ahead like an endless desert of loneliness and responsibility. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, understanding that some losses cut too deep for casual sympathy, but feeling compelled to acknowledge his pain. Joseph nodded, his attention returning to the present moment. "Thank you." His name was Little Wolf, and he was everything good about the world concentrated into one small person. When I lost him and his mother, I thought I was finished with caring about anyone. The admission hung between them like a bridge, connecting their separate experiences of loss and survival. Rebecca began to understand that Joseph's intervention at the auction might have been motivated by more than simple altruism. Perhaps he saw in her situation an echo of his own family's tragedy. "What happened to them?" she asked gently, recognizing that she was venturing into painful territory, but sensing that understanding his story was crucial to understanding her own situation. "The Trail of Tears," Joseph said simply, the 3 words, carrying the weight of a national tragedy that had scattered the Cherokee nation like leaves before a storm. "My wife, Morning Star, and our son were among the thousands who died during the forced removal to Indian Territory. Disease, exposure, and heartbreak claimed more lives than the government ever officially acknowledged." Rebecca had heard about the Cherokee removal, of course. Every person in Virginia knew the basic facts. The Supreme Court had ruled in favor of Cherokee sovereignty, President Jackson had ignored the ruling, and the military had forcibly relocated an entire people from their ancestral lands. But hearing about it from someone who had lived through the horror was entirely different. How did you survive when they didn't? The question slipped out before Rebecca could stop herself, and she immediately regretted its bluntness. Joseph didn't seem offended by her directness. "I was in Washington when the removal orders came, trying to negotiate with government officials who had no intention of honoring any agreement. By the time I realized what was happening, the soldiers had already taken my family. I tried to catch up with the march, but—" He shook his head, the memory still too painful for detailed recounting. "I found them in a camp outside of Nashville. Morning Star was already weak with fever, and Little Wolf was barely breathing. They died within days of each other, and I buried them beside a creek whose name I never learned." His voice remained steady, but Rebecca could see the cost of maintaining that composure. "I'm sorry," she said again, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. "I can't imagine that kind of loss." "It changes you," Joseph said quietly. "Makes you question everything you thought you knew about justice, about fairness, about whether decent people have any real power to protect the ones they love." Mary had grown fussy during their conversation, making the small sounds that indicated she would soon demand feeding. Rebecca shifted her daughter to a more comfortable position, acutely aware that her own needs and Mary's would now be Joseph's responsibility, according to the legal documents. "Mr. Thornfield," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something directly, and I need an honest answer." Joseph straightened, clearly recognizing the importance of whatever question was coming. "What do you expect from me in return for what you did today? The $500, the rescue from Cramond and Whitmore, what's the price for your kindness?" It was a fair question, one that cut to the heart of their unusual situation. Joseph had anticipated it, but finding the right words to answer honestly proved more difficult than he had expected. "I expect you to help me run a household and manage business correspondence," he said slowly. "I expect you to care for your daughter and create a stable home environment for both of you. And I expect you to tell me if I ever do anything that makes you uncomfortable or afraid." Rebecca studied his face intently, looking for signs of deception or hidden meanings behind his words. "That's all? 7 years of domestic service and correspondence management?" "That's all I expect," Joseph confirmed. "What I hope for is something different." "Which is?" Joseph glanced around the courthouse square, noting that the crowd was beginning to disperse as people returned to their daily business. The spectacle of the auction was over, but the consequences of what had transpired would ripple through their lives for years to come. "I hope that over time, you and Mary will come to see my home as your home. I hope that the arrangement we're beginning today will grow into something that benefits all of us. And I hope that when your 7 years are completed, you'll choose to stay not because you have to, but because you want to." The honesty in his voice was unmistakable, but Rebecca had learned to be cautious about trusting men's promises. And if I choose to leave when the contract ends, then I'll give you enough money to start fresh wherever you want to go, and I'll wish you well in whatever life you choose to build. Mary's fussing had escalated to actual crying, her infant sense of time telling her that feeding was overdue. Rebecca looked around the public square uncertainly, realizing that her daughter's needs couldn't wait for their conversation to reach a natural conclusion. "She needs to eat," Rebecca said apologetically. "Is there somewhere?" "My carriage is just down the street," Joseph said immediately. "We can drive to my house, and you can tend to her properly there, unless you'd prefer to remain in Richmond tonight. There's a respectable boarding house where you could stay if you need time to consider your options." The offer surprised Rebecca. She had expected to be immediately transported to wherever Joseph lived, like cargo being delivered to its destination. The suggestion that she might have choices in the matter was both welcome and unsettling. "Where is your house?" she asked. "About 12 miles outside the city, near the James River. It's comfortable but not grand. I built it for function rather than show. There's plenty of room for you and Mary, and privacy when you need it." 12 miles from Richmond meant isolation from the social connections that might provide alternative options if things went badly. On the other hand, isolation also meant privacy from the judgment and gossip that would inevitably follow their unusual arrangement. "I think," Rebecca said, slowly, "that we should go to your house. Mary needs stability more than I need time to think about options I don't really have." Joseph nodded, understanding the practical calculation behind her decision. "My carriage is comfortable, and the drive will give us time to discuss the details of our arrangement without half of Richmond listening to every word." As they walked toward the street where Joseph's carriage waited, Rebecca felt the weight of transition settling over her like a cloak. This morning, she'd been facing a future that terrified her. Now she was walking toward an unknown destiny with a man whose motivations she was only beginning to understand. The carriage was indeed comfortable, well-sprung, and appointed with the understated luxury that characterized everything about Joseph Thornfield. As they settled inside with Mary, Rebecca realized that the next few hours would determine whether her leap of faith had saved them or simply delayed their eventual destruction. Either way, there was no turning back now. The carriage rolled smoothly along the dirt road leading away from Richmond, its well-maintained wheels finding their rhythm on the packed earth, worn smooth by countless journeys between the capital and the riverside communities that dotted the James River Valley. Inside, Rebecca sat across from Joseph, cradling Mary, who had finally settled into peaceful sleep after being fed and changed in the privacy of the enclosed coach. The October afternoon sun filtered through the carriage windows, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across their faces as they traveled through Virginia's countryside. Ancient oak trees lined the road, their leaves transformed into brilliant displays of gold and crimson that spoke of autumn's steady advance toward winter. Under different circumstances, Rebecca might have found the journey beautiful. "Tell me about your trading company," Rebecca said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. She needed to understand the nature of the work Joseph expected from her, but more importantly, she wanted to gauge his character through his business practices. Joseph shifted slightly in his seat, clearly pleased by her interest. "I started it 3 years after the removal, when I realized that anger and grief weren't going to bring back my family or change what had happened to my people. I needed to find a way to build something positive from the ruins." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The company started small. I used my knowledge of Cherokee territory and tribal politics to help white merchants navigate trade agreements with the scattered communities that were trying to rebuild in Indian territory. It wasn't popular work on either side. Many of my own people saw me as a collaborator, while white businessmen questioned whether they could trust a Cherokee to represent their interests fairly. Rebecca listened intently, noting the complexity of Joseph's position. "How did you overcome that suspicion?" "By being more honest and reliable than anyone expected," Joseph replied with a slight smile. "I refused to inflate prices or misrepresent goods. When I told Cherokee communities that a merchant was trustworthy, he proved to be trustworthy. When I told white businessmen that a tribal council would honor an agreement, they honored it. Eventually, both sides realized that having someone who could bridge the cultural gap was worth more than their prejudices." The carriage hit a rough patch in the road, jostling them gently. Mary stirred but didn't wake, her tiny fist curled against her mother's chest. Rebecca adjusted her hold protectively, a gesture that didn't escape Joseph's notice. "The business expanded from there," he continued. "I began representing Eastern manufacturers who wanted to sell goods in frontier territories, and territorial producers who needed access to Eastern markets. Tobacco, furs, manufactured goods, livestock, anything that needed to move between cultures and across difficult terrain." "That must require a great deal of correspondence," Rebecca observed, beginning to understand why Joseph might genuinely need clerical assistance. "Enormous amounts," Joseph confirmed. "Letters to tribal councils explaining product specifications, contracts with shipping companies, negotiations with railroad developers, reports to investors who've never been west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I spend more time writing than I do traveling, which wasn't what I expected when I started the business." Rebecca found herself genuinely intrigued by the scope of Joseph's operation. "How do you manage communication across such distances?" "Some of those territories must be weeks away by mail. I've established relay stations and trusted representatives in key locations," Joseph explained, his voice warming with enthusiasm for his subject. "A Cherokee cousin in Arkansas, a German immigrant in Missouri, a former Army officer in Texas. Each one handles local arrangements and forwards messages along established routes. It's not fast, but it's reliable." The conversation revealed an unexpected side of Joseph's character. He was clearly a gifted organizer and strategist, someone who thought in systems and long-term planning. Rebecca began to see how her own skills might genuinely contribute to such an operation. "What about record-keeping?" she asked. "Account books, inventory tracking, tax documents?" Joseph's expression grew slightly embarrassed. "That's where my current system falls apart completely. I can negotiate complex trade agreements and navigate tribal politics, but I'm hopeless with detailed bookkeeping. Everything is scattered across dozens of notebooks and loose papers. I know roughly how much money I'm making, but I couldn't prove it to a tax assessor if my life depended on it." Despite her circumstances, Rebecca found herself smiling at his admission. "My father trained me in proper accounting methods. He said a horse breeder who couldn't track bloodlines and financial records would quickly find himself bankrupt and confused." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Rebecca agreed, her voice carrying warmth and sadness in equal measure. "He taught me that good records weren't just about money. They were about understanding patterns, predicting problems, and making informed decisions about the future." Joseph leaned forward slightly, clearly interested. "What kind of patterns?" Rebecca shifted Mary to her other arm, settling into a subject she understood thoroughly. "In horsebreeding, detailed records let you track which bloodlines produced the strongest offspring, which mares were most likely to have difficult births, which stallions passed on specific traits. The same principles apply to any business. If you track your transactions carefully, you can identify your most profitable routes, your most reliable partners, your seasonal patterns." "I never thought about it that way," Joseph admitted. "I've been treating each deal as a separate event, rather than part of a larger pattern." "That works when you're small," Rebecca said, surprising herself with how naturally she had slipped into discussing business strategy. But as you grow, the patterns become more important than the individual transactions. If you're handling correspondence and negotiations for dozens of different routes and partners, you need systems to help you see the bigger picture. The carriage began to climb a gentle hill, and through the windows, Rebecca could see the James River gleaming in the distance like a silver ribbon winding through the Virginia landscape. The sight reminded her that they were moving away from everything familiar, toward a future she couldn't predict. "Are you nervous?" Joseph asked, apparently reading her thoughts. Rebecca considered the question seriously. "Yes, but not for the reasons you might expect. I'm not afraid of work. I've been managing households and caring for Mary under much more difficult circumstances than what you're describing. What makes me nervous is the kindness." Joseph frowned, clearly not understanding. "Kindness makes you nervous?" "In my experience, when men are kind without obvious motivation, it usually means they want something they haven't asked for yet." Rebecca's voice carried the weight of hard-learned lessons. "William was extraordinarily kind during our courtship. He brought me flowers, wrote poetry, told me I was beautiful and intelligent. It wasn't until after we were married that I discovered what he expected in return for all that kindness." The admission created a moment of uncomfortable silence in the carriage. Joseph understood that Rebecca was warning him about her expectations, drawing boundaries based on past trauma that he would need to respect if their arrangement was going to work. "What did he expect?" Joseph asked quietly. Rebecca's jaw tightened. "Complete submission. No opinions of my own, no questions about his decisions, no resistance to anything he wanted to do. The kindness was an investment in purchasing my compliance, and when compliance wasn't enough, he used other methods to ensure my cooperation." Joseph felt familiar anger building in his chest, the same rage he had experienced watching Morning Star suffer during the removal, the helpless fury of seeing people he cared about destroyed by those with power over them. "He hurt you?" "Yes," Rebecca said simply, "and when I tried to protect myself, he hurt me more. By the end, I was afraid to speak in his presence, afraid to express any preference about anything, afraid to do anything that might trigger his anger." Mary stirred in her mother's arms, making soft baby sounds that drew both adults' attention. The contrast between innocence and the harsh realities they were discussing was stark and painful. "I need you to understand something," Rebecca continued, her voice steady, despite the difficulty of the subject. "I'm grateful for what you did today, and I'll honor our agreement completely. But I can't pretend to trust you simply because you've been kind to me for a few hours. Trust is something I'll have to learn again, slowly, if it's possible at all." Joseph nodded, understanding the courage it had taken for her to be so direct about her fears. "I appreciate your honesty, and I want you to know that you never have to pretend anything with me. If you're uncomfortable, say so. If you disagree with something, say so. If you need space or time alone, say so. Your opinions and preferences matter, and they always will." "That's easy to say now," Rebecca replied, not unkindly but with the wariness of someone who had heard similar promises before. "Ask me in 6 months whether you've lived up to those words." The carriage crested the hill, and Joseph pointed toward a cluster of buildings nestled in a bend of the James River below them. "That's home," he said simply. Rebecca leaned toward the window for a better view. Joseph's house was larger than she had expected, but built with the same understated elegance that characterized everything about him. 2 stories of warm brick with white shutters and a wraparound porch that suggested comfort rather than ostentation. A barn and several outbuildings were arranged around a central yard, and she could see gardens and orchards that spoke of careful planning and maintenance. "It's beautiful," she said, meaning it. The property had the settled, peaceful look of a place where someone had invested time and care in creating a real home rather than just a residence. "I designed it myself," Joseph said with quiet pride. "Built most of it with my own hands, though I hired help for the more complex work. Every room, every window, every detail was planned to create the kind of home I wished I could have given. Morning Star and Little Wolf." The admission revealed another layer of Joseph's motivation. This house was more than shelter. It was a monument to the family he had lost, and perhaps a foundation for the family he hoped to build again. Rebecca understood that bringing her and Mary here wasn't just about providing them with employment and safety, but about filling a space that had been empty for too long. As the carriage descended toward the river valley, Rebecca made a decision. She would approach this new chapter of her life with cautious optimism rather than pure defensiveness. Joseph had earned at least that much consideration through his actions at the auction and his honesty during their journey. Whether that optimism would prove justified remained to be seen. But for the first time since William's death, Rebecca allowed herself to hope that the future might hold something better than mere survival. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel drive leading to Joseph's front door, marking the end of one journey and the beginning of another that would test everything both of them thought they knew about trust, healing, and the possibility of building new families from the fragments of old ones. The front door of Joseph's house opened before they could knock, revealing a woman in her 50s with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a simple but well-made dress in deep blue, and her manner suggested someone accustomed to managing household affairs with quiet efficiency. "Mr. Thornfield," she said warmly, "I wasn't expecting you back until tomorrow." Her gaze shifted to Rebecca and Mary with curious but not unfriendly interest. "Plans changed, Ruth," Joseph replied, stepping aside to allow Rebecca to enter first. "Ruth Whitmore, I'd like you to meet Rebecca Hartford and her daughter Mary. They'll be staying with us." Rebecca caught the shared surname and looked sharply at Joseph, wondering if this woman was related to Dr. Ezra Whitmore from the auction. Ruth seemed to notice her reaction and smiled reassuringly. "No relation to that horrible man in Richmond, dear," Ruth said kindly. "Whitmore's a common enough name in Virginia, unfortunately. I've been keeping house for Mr. Thornfield for 2 years now, ever since my husband passed, and I needed employment." The interior of Joseph's house was as thoughtfully designed as its exterior suggested. The main hall featured warm wood paneling and Cherokee artifacts displayed alongside more traditional American furnishings, a blending of cultures that spoke to Joseph's complex identity. Natural light streamed through large windows, and the overall effect was both elegant and comfortable. "Ruth, Mrs. Hartford will be helping me with business correspondence and accounts," Joseph explained. "Could you prepare the blue bedroom for her and Mary, something suitable for a nursery arrangement as well?" "Of course," Ruth replied, her practical mind already working through the logistics. "Will you be staying for dinner, Mrs. Hartford? I've got a roast that will easily feed 4, and there's fresh bread cooling in the kitchen." The simple offer of a home-cooked meal nearly brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. She couldn't remember the last time someone had welcomed her somewhere without calculating what they might gain from her presence. "That's very kind," Rebecca managed, her voice slightly thick with emotion. "Mary and I would be grateful." Ruth nodded briskly and disappeared upstairs, the sound of her efficient footsteps suggesting that suitable accommodations would be arranged quickly. Joseph gestured toward a comfortable sitting room where afternoon light created warm pools on Persian rugs that had clearly been chosen for beauty rather than ostentation. "Ruth is invaluable," Joseph said, as they settled into chairs near the fireplace. "She manages the household, handles the correspondence I don't have time for, and keeps me fed and organized. I honestly don't know how I functioned without her." Rebecca noted the genuine affection in his voice when he spoke about his housekeeper. "She seems wonderful. How did you find her?" "She found me, actually," Joseph said with a slight smile. appeared at my door one morning about 2 years ago, explained that her husband had died, leaving her with limited options, and announced that I clearly needed someone to manage my domestic affairs properly. She was absolutely right. Just like that, just like that. Ruth has a gift for assessing situations and taking action. She'd observed my household from a distance. I live simply but not very efficiently, and concluded that we could benefit each other. Within a week of her arrival, my life was considerably more organized. Mary had begun to fuss again, picking up on the unfamiliarity of her surroundings. Rebecca stood to pace with her daughter, a motion that seemed to calm the baby's restlessness. As she moved around the room, she noticed details that revealed more about Joseph's character: books in both English and Cherokee syllabary, maps of Western territories marked with what appeared to be trade routes, and a collection of carefully maintained firearms that suggested someone who had learned to be prepared for trouble. "Tell me about the accounting work you'll need," Rebecca said, continuing to walk with Mary. "What kind of records are you currently keeping?" Joseph looked slightly embarrassed. "Everything's in my study, which I should probably warn you is in a state of controlled chaos. I have ledgers for major transactions, boxes of correspondence organized by month rather than topic, and a collection of notes about various deals that made sense when I wrote them, but are increasingly cryptic in retrospect. How many active business relationships do you maintain?" "About 40 regular trading partners, 15 shipping companies, 8 tribal councils, and perhaps 20 occasional clients who contact me for specific projects." Joseph paused, clearly realizing how overwhelming this might sound. "I should mention that not all of these require constant correspondence. Some are seasonal relationships, others only activate when specific opportunities arise." Rebecca stopped pacing, her practical mind already working through the organizational challenges. "Do you have a system for tracking which partnerships are most profitable, which routes are most reliable, which clients pay promptly versus which ones require collection efforts?" "Not really," Joseph admitted. "I know these things intuitively after working with people for several years, but I don't have formal records that would let me analyze patterns or make strategic decisions based on data." "That's exactly what my father did with his horse breeding." "Records," Rebecca said, her excitement about the project overcoming her caution. "He tracked everything: which bloodlines produced the healthiest foals, which mares were easiest breeders, which clients were most likely to purchase multiple animals. Over time, those records let him focus his efforts on the most profitable breeding combinations and the most reliable customers." Ruth appeared in the doorway, having completed her upstairs preparations with remarkable efficiency. "The blue bedroom is ready whenever you'd like to see it, Mrs. Hartford. I've arranged a corner that should work well for the baby, though we'll want to build a proper crib if this is to be a long-term arrangement." "Thank you, Ruth," Rebecca replied gratefully. "I'd like to get Mary settled before dinner if that's possible." "Of course, dear, right this way." The blue bedroom was larger than any room Rebecca had occupied since her childhood on her father's farm. 2 tall windows faced east toward the river, providing both natural light and a view of the water through the trees. The furniture was simple but well made: a comfortable bed, a writing desk, and a wardrobe that could easily accommodate her. Limited possessions. In one corner, Ruth had arranged a small area with a rocking chair and a basket lined with soft blankets that would serve as a temporary crib. "This is perfect," Rebecca said, meaning it completely. "I can't thank you enough." Ruth waved away her thanks with practical efficiency. "Mr. Thornfield believes in taking proper care of people, and so do I. You and your daughter are welcome here for as long as you need to stay." As Ruth departed to finish dinner preparations, Rebecca found herself alone in the room that would serve as her sanctuary for the foreseeable future. She laid Mary in the improvised crib, where the baby settled immediately, apparently comfortable with her new surroundings. Standing at the window, Rebecca looked out over Joseph's property toward the James River beyond. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber that made everything seem touched with magic. For the first time in months, she felt something that might cautiously be called peace. A soft knock on the door interrupted her contemplation. "Come in," she called, expecting Ruth with some additional domestic arrangement. Instead, Joseph appeared in the doorway, carrying a wooden box that appeared to contain business documents. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said, "but I thought you might like to see what you're getting yourself into before dinner." Rebecca gestured for him to enter, curious about the contents of the box. "Is that the controlled chaos you mentioned?" "A representative sample," Joseph said, setting the box. "On the writing desk. I brought the most recent correspondence and the ledgers from the past 6 months. If you can make sense of this, the rest will seem manageable by comparison." Rebecca approached the desk and opened the box, revealing an assortment of letters, invoices, receipts, and notebook pages covered in Joseph's neat but cramped handwriting. Even a quick glance revealed the organizational challenges he had described: important documents mixed with routine correspondence, financial records scattered across multiple notebooks, and a general lack of systematic filing that would make tracking anything extremely difficult. "How do you find anything?" she asked, genuinely puzzled. "I remember where most things are, roughly," Joseph replied, with a self-deprecating smile. "It's not an efficient system, but it's the one I developed when I was handling much smaller volumes of correspondence." Rebecca picked up one of the ledgers and flipped through several pages, noting the irregular entries and inconsistent formatting. "This is going to require a complete reorganization. New filing systems, standardized record formats, cross-referenced indexes for different types of information. Is that something you'd be willing to tackle?" "Willing?" Rebecca looked up from the ledger with genuine enthusiasm. "Mr. Thornfield, this is exactly the kind of challenge I love. My father always said that bringing order to chaos was one of life's most satisfying accomplishments." Joseph's relief was evident. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've been putting off this reorganization for 2 years because I knew it would be a massive undertaking." "It will be," Rebecca agreed. "But once it's done, maintaining the system will be much simpler. You'll be able to track your business patterns, identify opportunities you're missing, and make decisions based on actual data rather than memory and intuition." Mary chose that moment to wake from her nap with a cry that demanded immediate attention. Rebecca moved to tend to her daughter, lifting the baby from her makeshift crib and settling into the rocking chair to nurse her. "I should let you attend to Mary," Joseph said, moving toward the door. "Dinner will be ready in about an hour if that works for you." "That's perfect," Rebecca replied, already feeling more at home than she had dared to hope. "And Mr. Thornfield, thank you for all of this." Joseph paused in the doorway, his expression serious but kind. "Thank you for giving this arrangement a chance, Mrs. Hartford. I have a feeling we're going to accomplish great things together." As his footsteps faded down the hallway, Rebecca continued rocking Mary while looking around the comfortable room that represented the first step toward rebuilding their lives. The accounting work would provide mental stimulation she had missed desperately during the final months of her marriage, when William's drinking had made any intellectual conversation impossible. More importantly, the work would give her a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she would be using her education and natural abilities to contribute something meaningful rather than simply enduring whatever circumstances life imposed upon her. Mary finished nursing and settled into the drowsy contentment that followed a good meal. Rebecca held her daughter close, breathing in the sweet scent of baby skin and listening to the distant sounds of Ruth preparing dinner downstairs. Tomorrow, she would begin the enormous task of organizing Joseph's business records. She would create systems that would serve him for years to come, proving her value through competence rather than depending on his continued charity. It was the kind of fresh start she had stopped believing was possible. For now, though, it was enough to sit in a comfortable chair in a beautiful room, holding her healthy daughter while the aroma of home-cooked food drifted up from the kitchen. Below, after months of uncertainty and fear, Rebecca Hartford was finally beginning to believe that she and Mary might actually have a future worth looking forward to. 3 weeks into November, the first crisis arrived with the morning mail. Rebecca had spent the previous weeks transforming Joseph's chaotic business records into a masterpiece of organization. Color-coded filing systems tracked correspondence. By region and type, cross-referenced ledgers revealed patterns that had been invisible for years, and a comprehensive index allowed Joseph to locate any document within minutes rather than hours. The work had been intensely satisfying, combining her natural organizational skills with her father's accounting methods to create something genuinely valuable. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as autumn rain drummed against the windows of Joseph's study, a letter arrived that threatened to unravel everything they had been building together. "Mrs. Hartford," Joseph called from the main hall, his voice carrying an urgency that immediately put Rebecca on alert. She had been working at her newly organized desk, while Mary played contentedly in a basket nearby, and the sharp tone in Joseph's voice made her look up from the shipping manifest she had been reviewing. "Yes, Mr. Thornfield," she called back. Already moving toward the hallway, Joseph stood near the front door, still holding the leather mail pouch that the postal rider delivered twice weekly. In his other hand, he held a single sheet of paper that he was reading with an expression of barely contained anger. "We have a problem," he said grimly, handing her the letter. "It seems that yesterday's auction wasn't the end of our troubles." Rebecca took the paper and read quickly, her heart sinking with each line. The letter was written on expensive stationery bearing the letterhead of Whitman and Associates, Legal Counsel, Richmond, Virginia. The precise legal language couldn't disguise the threat it contained. "Dear Mr. Thornfield, it has come to our attention that irregularities may have occurred during the debt settlement auction of October 15th regarding Mrs. Sarah Rebecca Hartford and minor child. Our client, the Millfield Mining Company, has raised concerns about the circumstances surrounding your successful bid, particularly the excessive amount paid, which suggests possible manipulation of the auction process. Virginia. Territorial law requires that debt settlement auctions be conducted fairly and without coercion or interference from outside parties. The territorial court has agreed to review the matter and determine whether Mrs. Hartford's indenture contract should be voided and re-auctioned under proper supervision. You are hereby notified that Mrs. Hartford and her child must remain available for questioning by territorial officials. Any attempt to remove them from Virginia jurisdiction will be considered obstruction of justice and prosecuted accordingly. We trust you will cooperate fully with this investigation. Respectfully, Edgar J. Whitman, Esquire. Rebecca read the letter twice, her hands trembling slightly as the implications became clear. "They're trying to invalidate the auction results," she said quietly. "They want to put me back on the auction block." "Over my dead body," Joseph replied with cold fury. "This is Crammond and Whitmore trying to use the legal system to get what they couldn't win through legitimate bidding. Can they do this? Legally, I mean." Joseph took the letter back and studied it more carefully. "Unfortunately, yes. Territorial law does allow for auction challenges if fraud or coercion can be proven. The fact that I paid far more than the usual rate for an indenture contract gives them a legal opening to claim irregularities." Ruth appeared from the kitchen, drawn by the tension in their voices. She took one look at their faces and immediately understood that something serious had happened. "What can I do to help?" she asked simply. "We need legal advice," Joseph said, his mind already working through their options. "And we need it from someone who understands territorial law better than I do." "Judge Harrison," Ruth suggested immediately. "He's retired from the bench but still practices law privately. More importantly, he's a fair man who doesn't appreciate lawyers who twist the system for personal gain." Rebecca felt panic rising in her chest as the reality of their situation sank in. What if the court rules against us? What if they void the contract and order another auction? Joseph turned to face her directly, his dark eyes blazing with determination. "Then we'll find another way to protect you and Mary. I didn't spend $500 just to hand you over to men like Crammond and Whitmore at the first legal challenge. But if the court orders it, the court can order whatever it wants." Joseph interrupted. "That doesn't mean we have to comply. I have business interests in Arkansas Territory, connections in Texas, friends among the Cherokee communities in Indian Territory. If necessary, we'll disappear entirely." The offer was both reassuring and terrifying. Rebecca understood that Joseph was essentially proposing to abandon his established life in Virginia to protect her and Mary, but the cost of such a decision would be enormous for all of them. "I can't ask you to sacrifice everything you've built here," she said quietly. "You're not asking," Joseph replied firmly. I'm choosing to fight this rather than let corrupt men manipulate the legal system for their own purposes." Ruth nodded approvingly. "Mr. Thornfield is right, dear. Some things are worth fighting for, and protecting families from predators is definitely one of them." Mary chose that moment to wake from her morning nap, her crying drawing Rebecca's attention back to immediate practical concerns. As she moved to comfort her daughter, Rebecca's mind raced through the possible consequences of this legal challenge. If they lost in court, she would be forced to honor an indenture contract with either Crammond or Whitmore, both of whom would undoubtedly make her life miserable in retaliation for the trouble they had endured. If they fled Virginia to avoid a court's jurisdiction, Joseph would lose his business, his home, and his carefully constructed life. Neither option was acceptable. "There has to be another way," Rebecca said, settling into the rocking chair with Mary. "Some legal strategy that doesn't require us to abandon everything or submit to those men's demands." Joseph was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking through possibilities. "Judge Harrison would know if we have any viable defenses. The key question is whether paying a high price for an indenture contract actually constitutes fraud or manipulation under territorial law." "What about the original debt?" Ruth asked. "Is there any question about its legitimacy?" Rebecca looked up sharply. "Actually, there might be. William's debts were never properly documented when we married. He told me he owed some money for equipment and seed, but I never saw the actual contracts or promissory notes." "That could be significant," Joseph said with growing interest. "If the original debt was fraudulent or inflated, it would invalidate the entire auction process." "How would we prove that?" "By examining the documentation that the mining company used to justify the debt settlement," Joseph replied, his legal mind beginning to work through the problem. "They would have been required to provide proof of the debt to the territorial court before the auction was authorized." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "And if their proof was insufficient or fabricated, the court would have to dismiss their current challenge." Rebecca felt the first stirring of hope since reading Whitman's letter. William was drunk most of the time during his final months. It's entirely possible that he signed documents he didn't understand or that didn't accurately reflect what he had borrowed. Even if he did sign legitimate debt agreements, Joseph added, the mining company might have inflated the amounts through excessive interest charges or penalty fees that weren't legally enforceable. Mary had settled into contentment, allowing Rebecca to focus fully on their legal strategy. So our first step is to examine the original debt documentation? Exactly. We'll need copies of everything the mining company submitted to justify the auction: promissory notes, loan agreements, interest calculations, penalty assessments. If there are any irregularities in those documents, we can turn this challenge back on them. Ruth smiled with satisfaction. I like this approach much better than running away to Arkansas territory. So do I, Joseph agreed, but we need to move quickly. The letter doesn't specify when the court review will take place, which means it could happen at any time. Rebecca stood and handed Mary to Ruth, who accepted the baby with practiced ease. What do you need me to do? Help me prepare our defense, Joseph said immediately. Your accounting skills will be crucial for analyzing the financial documentation. If there are discrepancies or irregularities in the mining company's records, you're more likely to spot them than anyone else. The prospect of using her professional abilities to fight for her own freedom was both empowering and intimidating. I've never worked with legal documents before. Numbers are numbers, Joseph replied confidently. Whether they're tracking horse bloodlines or calculating debt obligations, the same principles of accuracy and consistency apply. If the mining company has fabricated or inflated William's debts, their mathematics won't add up properly. Ruth bounced Mary gently, the baby gurgling with pleasure at the attention. I'll handle all the household arrangements while you two focus on the legal work. And I'll send word to Judge Harrison requesting an immediate consultation. Thank you, Ruth, Joseph said gratefully. I don't know what we'd do without you. You'd manage, Ruth replied with characteristic practicality, but it would be considerably more difficult. Rebecca felt a surge of determination as she contemplated the challenge ahead. For weeks, she had been rebuilding her life through careful organization and methodical work. Now she would apply those same skills to protecting everything they had. Achieved together. Where do we start? She asked. Joseph moved toward his study, already mentally organizing their approach. We start by requesting copies of all documentation from the territorial court. Then we analyze every number, every date, every signature to identify any irregularities that would justify dismissing this challenge. And if we don't find any irregularities? Joseph paused in the doorway, his expression grim but resolute. Then we prepare for the possibility that legal remedies won't be sufficient to protect you and Mary. Rebecca understood the implication. If the courts failed them, Joseph was prepared to take whatever measures necessary to ensure their safety, regardless of the personal cost. The knowledge was both comforting and sobering. She had found someone willing to fight for her, but the battle ahead might require sacrifices from all of them. As they settled into Joseph's study to begin their legal research, Rebecca reflected on how much her life had changed since that terrible morning on the auction block. Then she had been powerless, dependent on the mercy of strangers who saw her as property to be purchased. Now she was fighting back with the support of people who valued her abilities and cared about her welfare. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as an equal partner rather than a helpless victim. The outcome was far from certain, but for the first time in years, Rebecca Hartford was fighting for something worth winning. Judge Harrison's private law office occupied the second floor of a weathered brick building on Richmond's Franklin Street, its windows overlooking the bustling commercial district where merchants and lawyers conducted the business that kept Virginia's economy flowing. The retired jurist had agreed to see Joseph and Rebecca immediately upon receiving Ruth's urgent message, understanding that territorial law challenges required swift action. At 72, Judge Thaddeus Harrison carried himself with the dignity of a man who had spent 4 decades interpreting law and dispensing justice. His white hair was carefully groomed, his clothes impeccable but not ostentatious, and his pale blue eyes missed nothing as he studied the unlikely pair who had requested his urgent assistance. "Mr. Thornfield," the judge said, rising from behind a desk covered with legal texts and case files. "I've heard about your trading company's success, and Mrs. Hartford, I understand you're at the center of this legal controversy." Rebecca felt nervous under the judge's scrutiny, acutely aware that this man's opinion could determine whether she would spend the next 7 years in safety or in the clutches of men who meant her harm. "Yes, Your Honor. Yes, Judge Harrison." "Please, sit." Harrison gestured toward 2 comfortable chairs positioned before his desk. "I've reviewed the preliminary documents that Whitman sent to the territorial court. Before we discuss your defense strategy, I need to understand exactly what happened at that auction." Joseph and Rebecca took turns recounting the events of October 15th, with Joseph explaining his decision to bid and Rebecca describing her fear of the other bidders. Judge Harrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "The central question," Harrison said when they had finished, "is whether Mr. Thornfield's high bid constitutes manipulation or fraud under territorial law. Whitman is arguing that no reasonable person would pay $500 for an indenture contract unless they had ulterior motives or prior knowledge that gave them an unfair advantage." "What kind of prior knowledge?" Rebecca asked. "Whitman suggests that you and Mr. Thornfield might have known each other before the auction, that this was a staged transaction designed to circumvent the legitimate debt settlement process." Joseph's jaw tightened. "That's completely false. I had never seen Mrs. Hartford before that morning." "Can you prove that?" Harrison asked bluntly. The question highlighted the challenge they faced. Proving a negative, that they hadn't known each other, would be nearly impossible, especially against lawyers willing to fabricate evidence. "Our best defense," Harrison continued, "is to attack the legitimacy of the original debt. If William Hartford's obligations to the mining company were fraudulent or artificially inflated, then the entire auction process was invalid from the beginning." Rebecca leaned forward eagerly. "I've been thinking about that. William's drinking got much worse in his final months, and he was making increasingly desperate decisions. It's entirely possible that he signed agreements he didn't understand, or that misrepresented the actual terms of his borrowing." Harrison nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of irregularity we need to find. Has the territorial court provided copies of the debt documentation yet?" Joseph reached into his leather satchel and withdrew a thick packet of papers. "They arrived yesterday. I've reviewed them briefly, but Mrs. Hartford's accounting expertise will be essential for identifying any discrepancies." Rebecca accepted the documents and began examining them immediately. The papers included promissory notes, equipment purchase agreements, and what appeared to be a complex loan arrangement for seed and supplies. Even at first glance, several things struck her as unusual. "These interest calculations don't look right," she said, pointing to a column of figures on one of the promissory notes. "The mining company is claiming that William borrowed $200 in March, but by October they're saying he owed $437. That's more than doubling the debt in 7 months." Judge Harrison moved around his desk to examine the documents over Rebecca's shoulder. What interest rate would justify that kind of increase? Rebecca quickly performed mental calculations, drawing on her father's training in financial mathematics. They'd have to be charging approximately 70% annual interest, compounded. Monthly, that's well above Virginia's legal maximum for commercial loans. Virginia law caps commercial interest at 12% annually, Harrison confirmed. If the mining company was charging usurious rates, their entire debt claim becomes legally unenforceable. Joseph felt hope stirring in his chest. So if we can prove they were charging illegal interest rates, the original debt becomes invalid. More than that, Harrison replied with satisfaction. Usury violations invalidate the entire contract, not just the excessive interest. William would have owed nothing, which means Rebecca should never have been subject to debt settlement auction at all. Rebecca continued examining the documents, her trained eye catching additional irregularities. There's something else strange here. This equipment purchase agreement is dated March 15th, but it references a delivery that supposedly occurred in February, and the signature on this promissory note doesn't look like the others. She held up 3 documents bearing William's supposed signature, pointing out subtle differences in handwriting style and pen pressure. My father taught me to examine signatures carefully when verifying horse pedigree documents. These don't appear to be written by the same person. Judge Harrison studied the signatures through a magnifying glass, comparing the letter formations and writing characteristics. You're absolutely right. These signatures show different hand tremors, different pressure patterns, and inconsistent letter spacing. At least one of these documents appears to have been forged. The revelation sent a chill through the room. Document forgery was a serious crime under territorial law, punishable by heavy fines and imprisonment. If the mining company had fabricated William's signature on loan agreements, they weren't just guilty of usury, they were guilty of fraud. Can we prove forgery in court? Joseph asked. With proper handwriting analysis, yes, Harrison replied. I know an expert in Richmond who specializes in document authentication for legal proceedings. If he confirms what we're seeing here, Whitman's clients will face criminal charges rather than a favorable court ruling. Rebecca felt excitement building as she continued her examination of the mining company's documentation. Judge Harrison, there's something else you should see. These dates create an impossible timeline. She spread several documents across Harrison's desk, pointing out a pattern of inconsistencies. According to these papers, William signed a loan agreement on March 20th for equipment that was supposedly delivered on March 18th. But this receipt shows he didn't actually receive the equipment until March 25th. And this promissory note is dated March 22nd, but it references conversations that supposedly occurred on March 24th. Harrison examined the chronology carefully, his experienced legal mind recognizing the significance of the discrepancies. This suggests that multiple documents were created after the fact, probably all at the same time, with someone making errors in the fabricated timeline. It gets worse, Rebecca continued, her accounting training revealing more problems with each document she examined. The total amount supposedly borrowed according to these individual agreements is $340, but the final debt settlement claim is for $437. Even with the illegal interest rates, the mathematics don't work. Joseph watched Rebecca systematically dismantle the mining company's case with growing admiration. Her combination of careful attention to detail and analytical thinking was revealing a level of fraud that went far beyond simple overcharging. Mrs. Hartford, Judge Harrison said with obvious respect, your analysis has uncovered what appears to be a comprehensive fraud scheme. The mining company didn't just charge excessive interest, they created entirely fictitious debt obligations backed by forged documents. What does this mean for their legal challenge? Joseph asked. Harrison smiled grimly. It means that Edgar Whitman is about to have a very bad day. When I present this evidence to the territorial court, his clients won't just lose their auction. Challenge? They'll face criminal prosecution for fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. Rebecca felt relief flooding through her as the implications became clear. So the indenture contract is definitely invalid. Completely invalid, Harrison confirmed. A debt settlement auction based on fraudulent documentation has no legal standing whatsoever. You're a free woman, Mrs. Hartford, and you always should have been. The weight of months of fear and uncertainty lifted from Rebecca's shoulders like a physical burden being removed. She had spent so long accepting her fate as an indentured servant that the possibility of genuine freedom seemed almost too good to believe. What happens next? Joseph asked. I'll file a motion with the territorial court requesting an immediate hearing to present this evidence, Harrison replied. I'll also notify the territorial prosecutor's office about the criminal fraud we've uncovered. Within a week, this entire matter should be resolved in your favor." "And Crammond and Whitmore?" Rebecca asked. "They'll be furious," Harrison said with satisfaction, "but they'll have no legal recourse. In fact, they may face investigation for, and their role in attempting to benefit from what they must have known was a fraudulent debt claim." As they prepared to leave Harrison's office, Rebecca felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had accomplished. In just a few hours of careful document analysis, she had uncovered fraud that would not only secure her freedom, but potentially send her tormentors to prison. "Judge Harrison," she said as they reached the door, "I can't thank you enough for your help." "Don't thank me, my dear," Harrison replied kindly. "Thank your father for teaching you to read financial documents so carefully. Without your accounting skills, this fraud might never have been discovered." Walking down Franklin Street toward Joseph's carriage, Rebecca felt as though she were seeing Richmond with new eyes, the city that had been the scene of her humiliation and near destruction was now the place where she had fought back and won her freedom through intelligence and determination. "What will you do now?" Joseph asked as they settled into the carriage for the ride home. Rebecca considered the question. Seriously, her indenture contract would soon be legally void, freeing her from any obligation to remain in Joseph's employment. She could go anywhere, do anything, start completely fresh with no legal constraints on her choices. "I'd like to continue working for you," she said finally, "if you'll have me. Not as an indentured servant, but as a genuine employee who chooses to stay because the work is meaningful and the arrangement benefits everyone involved." Joseph smiled with obvious relief. "I was hoping you'd say that. Honestly, I can't imagine running my business without your organizational skills now that I've seen what properly managed records can accomplish. And Mary is always welcome. In fact, I've been thinking that this house is too big and too quiet for just Ruth and me. Having a child around makes it feel more like a real home." As their carriage rolled through Richmond's streets toward the James River Valley, Rebecca reflected on the extraordinary changes that had transformed her life in just over a month. She had entered the city as a debt slave, facing a future of exploitation and abuse. She was leaving as a free woman with meaningful work, supportive friends, and hope for whatever came next. The legal victory was complete, but the real victory was deeper. She had rediscovered her own strength and capability, proving to herself that she was far more than a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Whatever challenges the future might bring, Rebecca Hartford would face them as a free woman with the skills and confidence to shape her own destiny. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning in May 1848, Rebecca stood in the doorway of Joseph's study, watching him review the quarterly business reports she had meticulously prepared. The transformation of his trading company's operations had been remarkable. What had once been a collection of scattered notebooks and loose papers had evolved into a sophisticated business enterprise, with clear documentation, strategic planning, and measurable growth objectives. "These profit margins are extraordinary," Joseph said, looking up from the leather-bound ledger that now tracked every aspect of his commercial activities. "I had no idea that the Arkansas Territory route was generating nearly 30%, more revenue than our Virginia operations." Rebecca smiled with quiet satisfaction. "The Cherokee communities there have been rebuilding faster than anyone expected. Your reputation for fair dealing has made you their preferred trading partner for manufactured goods from the eastern markets." The legal resolution of their case had been even more decisive than Judge Harrison had predicted. The territorial court had not only voided Rebecca's indenture contract, but had ordered the Millfield Mining Company to pay substantial restitution for their fraudulent debt claims. Edgar Whitman had been censured by the Virginia Bar Association, while Silas Crammond and Dr. Ezra Whitmore faced ongoing criminal investigations that had effectively destroyed their reputations in Richmond society. More importantly, for Rebecca's personal sense of justice. The court's ruling had established legal precedent that would protect other widows from similar exploitation. Judge Harrison had specifically commended her analytical work in uncovering the fraud, noting that her accounting expertise had prevented a serious miscarriage of justice. "I've been thinking about expanding our operations," Joseph said, closing the ledger and giving Rebecca his full attention. "These reports show we have the financial foundation to support a much larger enterprise, but that would mean significantly more correspondence, more complex record-keeping, and probably establishing permanent offices in several territories." Rebecca had been anticipating this conversation for weeks. Joseph's business success had grown beyond what could be effectively managed from a single location along the James River, but expansion would require decisions that affected everyone in their unconventional household. "What kind of expansion are you considering?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "A full-scale trading company with representatives in at least 6 territories, warehouses for bulk storage, and regular shipping contracts that could move large quantities of goods efficiently." Joseph's eyes brightened with the enthusiasm he always showed when discussing business strategy. "We could be the primary commercial link between Eastern manufacturers and Western settlements, facilitating trade that would benefit everyone involved." "That sounds like it would require a considerable investment," Rebecca observed. "About $15,000 in initial capital, according to my calculations," Joseph confirmed. "I have most of that available, but it would represent a significant financial commitment." Rebecca studied his face, reading the excitement he was trying to contain behind his businesslike demeanor. "You want to do this, don't you?" "I do," Joseph admitted. "This could be the foundation for something truly significant, not just a profitable business, but a way to build economic connections that bring different communities together instead of driving them apart." It was a noble vision, one that reflected Joseph's deep commitment to healing the divisions that had caused so much suffering for his own people and others caught between conflicting cultures. Rebecca understood that this expansion represented more than financial opportunity. It was his chance to create something positive from the ashes of personal tragedy. "Where would you establish the main headquarters?" she asked. Joseph hesitated, clearly having wrestled with this question extensively. "That's the complication. The logical location would be St. Louis, where we could access both river and railroad transportation. But that would mean leaving Virginia, leaving this house, leaving everything we've built here." Rebecca felt her heart skip at the implications. A move to Missouri would separate her from the only stability she had known since her parents' deaths, but it would also offer opportunities that were impossible to achieve in Virginia's more traditional society. "What does Ruth think about the idea?" "I haven't discussed it with her yet," Joseph said. "I wanted to hear your thoughts first, since your work would be most directly affected by the expansion." The admission revealed how much their relationship had evolved since that October morning at the auction block. Joseph no longer made unilateral decisions about their shared future. He sought her input as an equal partner whose opinions carried real weight in his planning. "I think," Rebecca said slowly, "that you should pursue this opportunity, but not just because it makes business sense." Joseph raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "Because it would allow you to build something that honors your family's memory while creating opportunities for other families to prosper. That's not just good business, it's meaningful work that justifies whatever personal sacrifices might be required." The understanding in her voice seemed to lift a weight from Joseph's shoulders. "I was hoping you'd see it that way. The truth is, I can't imagine attempting this expansion without your organizational skills and analytical abilities. You've become essential to every aspect of this business." "Not just the business," Rebecca said quietly. Joseph met her gaze, recognizing the deeper meaning behind her words. Over the months they had lived and worked together, their professional partnership had gradually evolved into something more personal, a mutual respect and affection that neither of them had explicitly acknowledged, but both had come to depend upon. "Rebecca," he said, using her first name for perhaps the 12th time since she had come to live in his house. "I need to tell you something that I should have said weeks ago." She waited, her heart beating faster as she sensed the importance of whatever he was about to reveal. "When I bought your indenture contract, I told myself I was saving Catherine through you, trying to rectify an old failure by preventing a new tragedy. That was partly true, but it wasn't the complete truth." Rebecca remained silent, allowing him to find his way through emotions he had clearly been struggling to understand. "The complete truth is that watching you stand on that auction platform, seeing your courage in the face of impossible circumstances, recognizing your intelligence and strength despite everything you'd endured, I knew immediately that you were someone I wanted in my life, not as property, not as an employee, but as a partner in whatever future we might build together." The admission hung in the air between them, transforming their careful professional relationship into something that required new definitions and new possibilities. "Joseph," Rebecca said softly, "I need you to understand something as well. For months after William's death, I believed I would never trust another man with any aspect of my life or Mary's welfare. I thought the capacity for trust had been beaten out of me permanently." She paused, gathering courage for her own admission. "But you've proven me wrong, not through grand gestures or dramatic promises, but through consistent kindness, respect for my opinions, and genuine care for Mary's well-being. You've restored my faith in the possibility that good men exist, that partnerships can be based on mutual respect rather than domination." Joseph felt his heart race as he recognized the direction their conversation was heading. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if your business expansion includes a proposal for a different kind of partnership between us, I would be interested in hearing it." The careful phrasing allowed both of them to maintain dignity while acknowledging feelings that had been growing for months. Joseph stood and moved around his desk, stopping just close enough to Rebecca's chair that he could offer his hand. "Rebecca Hartford," he said formally, "would you consider becoming my wife, my business partner, and my companion for whatever adventures the future might bring? Not because circumstances force you to, but because you choose to build a life with someone who loves and respects you completely?" Rebecca looked up into his dark eyes, seeing none of the possessiveness or calculation that had characterized her previous experience with marriage proposals. Instead, she saw genuine affection, respect, and hope for a shared future built on equality rather than submission. "Yes," she said simply, placing her hand in his, "I would consider it. In fact, I accept." Joseph's smile transformed his entire face, revealing a joy that had been absent since Morningstar's death nearly 10 years earlier. "I promise you'll never regret this decision." "I know I won't," Rebecca replied with confidence, born of months of careful observation. "Because this partnership is based on choice rather than necessity, on mutual respect rather than legal obligation, and on shared dreams rather than individual desperation." The sound of footsteps in the hallway announced Ruth's approach, followed by Mary's delighted babbling as the toddler practiced her newest accomplishment, walking while holding onto furniture and walls for support. At nearly a year old, Mary had become the household's source of constant entertainment and occasional chaos. "Am I interrupting something important?" Ruth asked from the doorway, clearly noting the charged atmosphere in the study. "Actually," Joseph said, still holding Rebecca's hand, "you're arriving at the perfect time. We have several announcements to make." Ruth entered the room carrying Mary, who immediately reached toward Rebecca with the imperious demands of a child accustomed to being the center of attention. As Rebecca settled her daughter on her lap, she marveled at how naturally this felt, discussing life-changing decisions while managing the practical demands of motherhood, surrounded by people who had become her chosen family. "The first announcement," Joseph said, "is that Rebecca has agreed to marry me." Ruth's face lit up with genuine delight. "Finally, I was beginning to wonder if you two would ever acknowledge what was obvious to everyone else." Rebecca laughed at Ruth's blunt response. "Were we really that transparent?" "My dear," Ruth said with affectionate exasperation, "you've been acting like a married couple for months. The only thing missing was the official ceremony and sleeping arrangements." Joseph cleared his throat, slightly embarrassed by Ruth's directness, but pleased by her approval. "The second announcement is that we're planning to expand the business significantly, which would probably require relocating to Missouri." Ruth nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense from a business perspective. Missouri would give you access to trade routes that are impossible to manage from Virginia." "You don't seem concerned about leaving Virginia," Rebecca observed. "At my age, the location matters less than the company," Ruth replied pragmatically. "Besides, I've been wanting to see more of the country before I'm too old to travel comfortably." Mary chose that moment to demonstrate her newest vocabulary word, mama, while reaching toward a book on Joseph's desk. The simple interaction reminded all three adults that their decisions affected not just their own futures, but the future of a child who would grow up shaped by the choices they made today. "There's one more thing we need to discuss," Joseph said, his tone becoming more serious. "If we're going to be married and relocate to Missouri, we need to decide what kind of life we want to build there." Rebecca understood the deeper question. He was asking. Marriage would give her social respectability and legal protection, but it would also create expectations about her role in their expanded household and business operations. "I want to continue working as your business partner," she said firmly. "Not just keeping house and raising Mary, though those are important too. I want to be involved in the strategic decisions, the financial planning, the development of new trade relationships." "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say," Joseph replied with relief. "I need a true partner, not just a wife who happens to live in the same house." Ruth smiled approvingly. "Mr. Thornfield, you're a wise man. Mrs. Hartford has a brilliant mind for business, and it would be foolish to waste that talent on purely domestic arrangements." "So we're all agreed?" Joseph asked, looking around the room at the faces of the people who had become his family. "Marriage, business expansion, relocation to Missouri, and continued partnership in all aspects of our shared enterprise?" "Agreed," Rebecca said without hesitation. "Agreed," Ruth confirmed. Mary contributed her opinion by clapping her hands enthusiastically, apparently approving of whatever decision the adults had reached. As spring sunlight streamed through the study, windows illuminating the carefully organized business records that represented their shared accomplishment, Rebecca reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. Less than 8 months ago, she had stood on an auction block, facing a future that terrified her, convinced that her life had been reduced to whatever value strangers might place on her labor. Now she was planning a wedding, a business expansion, and a cross-country move as an equal partner in enterprises that would affect dozens of communities across multiple territories. The transformation was so complete that it sometimes felt like the woman on the auction block had been someone else entirely, but she remembered that frightened young mother because the memory reminded her never to take her current happiness for granted. She had learned that circumstances could change dramatically and without warning, that security was something to be built carefully and protected vigilantly. More importantly, she had learned that her own strength and intelligence were resources that no one could take away from her, regardless of what legal documents might say about her status or obligations. The accounting skills her father had taught her had literally saved her life, proving that education and competence were the foundation. of genuine independence. "When should we plan the wedding?" Joseph asked, bringing her attention back to practical considerations. "Soon," Rebecca replied. "I don't see any point in lengthy engagements when we're already certain about our decision." "Next month," Ruth suggested. "That would give us time to plan properly, but not so much time that we lose momentum on the business expansion." "Next month sounds perfect," Joseph agreed. "And then we can spend the summer preparing for the move to Missouri." Mary had grown drowsy in her mother's arms, lulled by the familiar voices and comfortable surroundings that had become her entire world. Looking down at her daughter's peaceful face, Rebecca felt overwhelming gratitude for the series of events that had brought them to this safe, loving environment. Mary would grow up in a household where women's intelligence was valued, where different cultures were respected, where business partnerships were based on equality rather than exploitation. She would never know the fear and helplessness that had defined her mother's early adult years. "There's something I want to add to our plans," Rebecca said suddenly. "I want to use part of our business success to help other women in situations like the one I faced, widows with children, families destroyed by fraudulent debt claims, women who need legal assistance they can't afford." Joseph's expression showed immediate understanding and approval. "A foundation for legal aid and emergency assistance?" "Exactly. We could work with lawyers like Judge Harrison to identify cases where people are being exploited, provide financial support for proper legal representation, maybe even investigate debt claims before they reach the auction stage." Ruth nodded enthusiastically. "That's a wonderful idea. Use your success to prevent other families from experiencing what you went through." "It would also be good business," Joseph added thoughtfully. "Fraudulent debt schemes hurt legitimate commerce by creating uncertainty about contract enforcement. Supporting honest business practices benefits everyone." As they began discussing the practical details of establishing such a foundation, Rebecca felt the final piece of her emotional healing falling into place. She had not only survived her ordeal and built a new life from its ashes, she was now in a position to help others avoid similar suffering. The woman who had stood on the auction block 8 months ago had been powerless, dependent on the mercy of strangers. The woman planning her wedding and business expansion was someone who could extend that same mercy to others, transforming her personal victory into something that would benefit entire communities. Outside the study windows, the James River continued, its eternal flow toward the Chesapeake Bay, carrying the dreams and hopes of countless families toward whatever futures awaited them. Soon, Rebecca and Joseph would join that westward movement, carrying their own dreams toward Missouri and the larger destiny they would build together. But for now, it was enough to sit in the warm spring sunlight, holding her daughter and surrounded by people who had chosen to love her not despite her past, but because of the strength she had found within it. The auction block was behind her forever, and the future stretched ahead like an open road leading toward possibilities she was only beginning to imagine. The Cherokee Chief had indeed raised his hand and changed 2 destinies. But in the end, those destinies had been shaped less by his intervention than by the courage, intelligence, and determination of a young woman who had refused to accept that her story was finished simply because cruel men had tried to write its ending. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.